Holly had always been cautious, the kind of person who kept the lights on at night, locked all the doors and double-checked everything before leaving her house. Her life had always been ordinary, filled with work, friends, and the occasional evening alone in her apartment. Nothing out of the ordinary ever happened until that day. It started with a simple glance in the mirror. Holly had just moved into a new apartment. It was a small place on the second floor, nestled in a quiet part of the city. The rent was cheap, and the location was perfect for someone with her busy schedule. The apartment itself was old but charming. Wooden floors, a small but cozy living room, and a bedroom with a large full-length mirror that stood near the closet. It was the mirror that caught her attention that first night. Holly was unpacking her things, a few boxes scattered around the living room. She'd been working late and had barely eaten all day, so she decided to take a break and grab some food. She stood in front of the mirror to check her appearance and saw nothing out of the ordinary. Her reflection looked tired, but she figured that was to be expected. It had been a long day. But then she noticed something strange. At the edge of the reflection, in the corner where the mirror met the wall, there was a shadow, a shape that didn't belong. She turned quickly, expecting to see a chair or a box out of place, but the room was empty. Only the small, faint light of the lamp in the corner illuminated the space. Nothing was casting a shadow where she'd seen it. Confused, Holly shook her head. It was nothing, just a trick of the light, she told herself. She turned back to the mirror. There, in the corner of her reflection, the shadow was still there. It was like a human figure, tall and thin, standing in the shadows just beyond her reach. The shape was indistinct, but its presence was undeniable. She blinked and it was gone. Her reflection was just as it should be. But the unease settled deep in her chest, making her heart race. The next day, Holly tried to ignore it, brushing it off as fatigue or her imagination getting the best of her. But every time she passed by the mirror, she couldn't help but glance at it, half expecting to see that same shape lurking just out of view. And every time it was gone. Nothing. But one night, as she was getting ready for bed, it happened again. The figure appeared once more in the reflection, just as it had before. Only this time it wasn't just standing there. It was closer, its shape becoming clearer. Its arms seemed unnaturally long, its posture twisted. Holly's breath caught in her throat. She quickly spun around, but the room was empty. The mirror reflected nothing but her own image, standing there in shock. Panic set in. She reached up and touched her neck, the skin cold with fear. What was happening? Was it the mirror? Was she seeing things? As the days passed, it became worse. The shadow didn't just appear in the reflection anymore, it started to move. Holly would see it shifting in the corner of her eye, always just on the edge of the mirror, always just out of sight. Sometimes she could feel it lurking behind her, waiting, like it was watching her every move. And every time she turned to face it, it would disappear. But it wasn't gone. She started to lose track of time. She would find herself standing in front of the mirror, hours passing without her realizing it. Her mind grew foggy, thoughts scattering. She couldn't remember when she'd last eaten or slept. The shadow seemed to be draining her, pulling her into itself with every passing moment. It wasn't just in the mirror anymore, it was with her, following her, lurking in the corners of her apartment. At night she could hear faint scratching noises coming from the walls. At first she thought it was rats or the old building settling, but as the noises grew louder she began to suspect something far more sinister. The figure was getting bolder. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Holly returned home to find the apartment feeling strangely cold. The windows were closed, the heater was on, but the air was frigid. She immediately noticed the mirror. Now it was impossible to ignore. It stood in front of her, almost beckoning her to approach. The shadow was there again, but this time it was right behind her. She could feel its presence, the coldness, the weight of it pressing down on her. The figure in the reflection was no longer distant. It was there, standing directly behind her in the mirror, its long fingers brushing against the back of her neck. With shaking hands, Holly reached out toward the mirror, hoping to touch it, to make it stop. But as soon as her fingers made contact with the cold glass, the figure in the reflection moved. It leaned closer to her, its distorted face now visible. A hollow, eyeless visage with a twisted, gaping mouth. Holly screamed, pulling away from the mirror, but the figure didn't vanish. It stayed in the glass, watching her, its twisted lips stretching into a wide grin. It was as if the figure wanted her to see it, as if it were waiting for something. Terrified, Holly backed away, her body shaking uncontrollably. The figure's eyes never left her. The longer she stared at it, the more she felt like it was pulling her in. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. The figure's grin grew wider, and it reached out through the glass toward her. Suddenly, Holly's reflection began to change. Her own face twisted into something unrecognizable, her mouth stretching into the same grin. Her reflection was no longer her own. It was as if the shadow had taken over, controlling her very image. The last thing Holly remembered before everything went dark was her reflection reaching out from the mirror, pulling her in with cold, long fingers. The next morning the apartment was silent. The mirror stood in its usual spot, but Holly was gone. No trace of her remained, except for the faint reflection that remained in the glass, a twisted, hollow version of her face, grinning wildly. Some say Holly's soul is trapped in the mirror, forced to live on in the reflection, while the shadow waits for its next victim. And every now and then, if you stand close enough to that mirror, you can see her, her distorted, grinning face staring back